This episode of the podcast was recorded on the 12th of June 2024 at home in Wicklow. And in it, I am talking about making art, creating characters, creating stories, and then having people assume or believe or perceive that those works or those characters or the things that play out in the work are a direct replication of what is inside the creator's head. And I'm making the argument that no, that's not the case. I don't believe it to be the case. I think other things are more commonly and reliably identified as common threads. And to illustrate this, I read one of my own short stories written a few years ago, and it has a female protagonist. And the case I'm trying to make is that I hope you don't listen to that and then think this is what Dara believes about all women. And I'm trying to make the argument, no, that is not the case. This is just one character's experience, one character's inner life. So that is what's coming up. A story about a woman in a particularly difficult moment in her life, and I tried to capture something that was believable and interesting and of dramatic interest, and I hope you enjoy it. So I will bring that to you shortly. I'll see you around the corner. Cheers.
Not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. How have you been? How's your week been? How are you getting on right now? You have my permission. You can check in with yourself. Maybe you don't need to check in with yourself. Maybe you know exactly how you are. Is that common? Or is that rare? Do you think most people know how they are most of the time? Or do a lot of people just go around in varying states of denial, just not listening to those inner voices, not listening to those signals that are screaming for attention? The louder they scream, the more you ignore them. It's my approach to fatherhood when my daughter was born. That's not true. Anyway, here we are, and back into the normal run of things after my 5-part series on masculinity. I hope you had a chance to listen to some of those episodes, or all of them. That would be great. I think there was enough in there across the 5 episodes to come away with some thinking fodder. Yeah. And funnily enough, I was just having a bite to eat before sitting down to record, and there was an article on the Guardian website about the Sigma male. I did not mention Sigma males or Sigma masculinity once in the 5 episodes. And certainly the article I just read does not make me regret that. The Sigma male idea seemed to first come on my radar a few years ago. And from what I read in the article, it came to prominence or went viral about 4 years ago. I mean, simply, the Sigma male is not merely an alpha male, but like a loner, someone that all the other men, aspire to be. The lone wolf, the one that stands apart and doesn't necessarily need or want to be part of the clan, the group, the herd. He doesn't have any desire to be a leader. The Sigma male is completely self-reliant and indifferent to women, it would seem. Can tolerate them, can enjoy the pleasures that they offer, but is in no way dependent on them. So Sorry. So you can see another sort of male, an iteration of masculinity that has seems to have gained great purchase in the online spaces where so many of these ideas play out, and where so many people advocate this kind of idealized, ultra successful, ultra masculine, ultra muscular version of masculinity. And I always find myself scratching my head, kind of going, are there so many men out there who are just terrified of being normal? I mean, maybe that's the wrong conclusion to come to, but that's what I think. I'm like, it's all right, lads, relax. You don't have to be John Wick. Excuse me, sorry. It just I always come back to this kind of, it just feels so immature, and desperate and uninformed, and fantastical. Anyway, look, what can you do? I won't jump to conclusions, and that's kind of the point of today's episode. The conclusions that we can jump to based on exposure to one part of a person's identity, or on the basis of exposure to one part of their personality, one part of what they're putting out in the world. And again, I find it's kind of symptomatic of how a lot of things are discussed and perceived and understood in the current age, where, and it's partially that social media culture, the swiping, the scrolling, the barely digesting of things, the mass consumption of quickly digestible things that are really insubstantial, and are cultivating the habit in people of having multiple very strong opinions with no real consideration, no real research, no real knowledge base, but rather just conflating ideas and regurgitating sound bites and getting caught up in the maelstrom of discourse around any number of topics. And someone speaks and we go, oh, what an idiot. What a gobshite. And the thing is, you can go, oh, well, that's just the modern age. But we do it. We jump to conclusions. We make assumptions. And what I'm going to do on today's episode, which will make it a shorter episode than usual, I expect, I'm going to read you a short story I wrote a few years ago. And it has a female protagonist. And I remember I shared it with a female friend, colleague, who was very quick to assert that this is not what all women are like. And I didn't hear that as an attack. I was like, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I'm not pretending my one female protagonist is representative of all women. My female protagonist is representative of herself, and I'm using her as a vessel for some ideas that are things that I've encountered in the real world from real women, but not all real women. And she's a work of fiction, so it's a concentration of those ideas for what is hopefully dramatic effect. And I felt I'm happy with the story. I have been happy with the story. I stand by it. And I just had an impulse to, maybe I'll share that story on the pod today, which I don't do a lot of. In fact, I think I've only done a few Christmas stories for the Christmas episodes of the last 3 Christmases. Yes, the podcast, just speaking of that, the magic number 3, the podcast is 3. I kind of let that go by without much fanfare. But the podcast turned 3 a couple of weeks ago. So happy birthday to the podcast. Happy birthday to the podcast. Happy birthday to the podcast. This one, the clear out. Happy birthday to the podcast. Thanks for listening. You're really special and great and wonderful. All right, that's it. So, yeah. No, it's a funny one because, it when you put stuff out there, particularly, works of art, and for argument's sake, let's call my writing a work of art. It's creative output. Let's put it that way. And so people will go, "Oh, this is what he thinks," or "This is what she thinks. That's what she's done." And I'm always a bit, bemused by that people are very quick to go, "This is like a direct 1-for-1." From inside the creator / artist's brain to the page, the canvas, the screen, whatever it might be, and it just comes out like that is perfect, replication of this person's belief system. And I just kind of go, look, it's not the case. I think other things can come through, of course. There's something in the expression, and there's something in the mode, and I think that's, and then I think thematically, obviously you can come across themes that artists and creatives are drawn to and repeat and revisit. I mean, that's very evident, when you look at the works of certain film directors, when you look at the works of certain authors, songwriters, painters, you name it. Choreographers, they have their signature style, their signature phrases, their signature dynamics. And I think that, that's where you can go, okay, that is what that person wants. That's what they're interested in. That's what they're interested in talking about, showing. That's the story they're interested in telling. And I think for me, if I kind of reflect on, many of the short stories that I've written, they're all very often about human struggle and the struggle of individuals, and their internal struggles, and how that plays out externally and what it puts them into conflict with externally. So, I wrote a story a few years ago called Polymorph 5. And it sounds like it should be, like a science fiction short story, but it was actually about a group of male friends who were chocolate fanciers, and they'd meet in an unused upstairs room in a pub. It was set in Dublin, and they'd do chocolate tastings. So it was sort of a look at male friendship, male bonding, and how the group comes into a conflict point when one of the members reveals certain not very judicious attitudes to black women, and has been grooming a younger black woman who works in his shop, and how that kind of explodes in one of the chocolate meetings. So, so what does that story think? Okay, so Dara, you must be, I don't know, you must have weird sexual peccadillos, or you must be obsessed with chocolate, or you must know somebody who's like that. No, I don't. But again, you create a situation, you create characters to explore an area of tension, because you hope it might be of interest. I mean, I wrote another story about the son of a famous traditional musician who is also a musician but lives in the shadow of his deceased great father, and goes off on adventure to South America, and pursues women, and lives this kind of dissolute, chaotic, sex-driven life, until he's sort of saved by a sort of a indigenous shaman who sees something in the young man that is worth saving. And again, I had a friend go, "Oh, you must be having a lot of issues with your sex life at the moment." I'm like, no, that's not what this story. That's not why I wrote this story. It starts with an impulse. It starts with some impulse, or a character trait, or a phrase, or a scenario, and then you see, you follow that. You follow the thread and see where it leads. So, in any case, I mean, so I suppose like that, this all sounds like a disclaimer. No, it shouldn't. That's not what I'm trying to say. But it's kind of about character identification. So, like identifying with a character. So you might have that as the consumer of something. You watch a movie, you read a book, whatever it might be. You follow the story of a song and go, oh, I identify with that story, that experience. I think that's very common. I mean, it's one of the reasons we're drawn to, these forms of artistic expression, which so often are trying to relate tales of human experience. And then you have the opposite, where if you're someone who's creating something, you're identified with what you create. So someone like, for example, maybe Ian Fleming is forever identified with James Bond, who he created in written form. And you go, okay, so this is Ian Fleming's fantasy of what he would like to be, or his fantasy of what he thinks an alpha male spy would be, secret agent, whatever. Philip Roth. I mean, Philip Roth, I spoke about this not that long ago, didn't I? The characters that he was writing about, you just go, oh my goodness. The same, obsessions and interests come up again and again in his characters, particularly in those later novels, before he passed away. So, it's hard not to go, hold on, is this you? Are you writing about yourself? Anyway, look, I'm going to read you this story and you can see what you think yourself. And as I said, it has a female protagonist, but I do not believe this is the experience or the thinking or the feeling of all women. That would be absurd. Nobody has that knowledge about anybody. So this is one person's journey. And I hope you like what you hear. So this story is called David Has Been Great. When asked, she knew it was already sitting just inside her lips, perfectly formed and coloured, waiting to be deployed. Throw them a little titbit, a morsel, something to seize upon. The clucking would immediately ensue, with tones of earnest affirmation and looks of pained sympathy. She envisioned feathers and squawking and scratched dirt and blood, and then blissful silence caressing the carnage. In that place she shook and swayed, with bone-deep exhaustion, sinking slowly to the ground in an old dress she'd never owned, her arms limp at her sides, her head lolling towards her right shoulder, ready to prop itself on an invisible pillow, while around her the hens' headless bodies would twitch and walk and turn and drop. Her hands remained clean, spotlessly so, and there she'd stay, slumped to the side, neither able to get up nor to lie down, the bramble and nettle-covered dirt no less enticing than the bed she wished she could disappear into. She needed only the smallest patch of dirt upon which to lay her cheek, and she was certain sleep would come, regardless of the subterranean industry roiling mere inches below the surface. The barely audible scratches of a million insect feet would lull her to oblivion. The earth didn't have to open up to take her whole. There was nothing so dramatic in her fantasy. It was the stillness she craved. Why not let those nettles and brambles slowly grow over her, gently pinning her in place, allowing her to be left alone? But no. Even in her own escapist reverie, she was refused permission to settle. She didn't get to lie down. She didn't get to rest her eyes. She didn't get the blanket of silence she so desperately wanted. She had shoes with a pebble in them, a dress with coarse stitching that wouldn't stop aggravating her, pants that pushed hard on the dead skin of her wound. Does your mammy have a wound? She thought, as she looked at little Sadie bouncing on her friend's knee. Sadie regarded her the way a child does, with an unashamed stare that said, I am looking at you and nothing else in this moment. You are the entire object of my fascination until my mammy tickles me, or I am hungry, or I fill my nappy, or I fall off this knee. She couldn't tell her friend how seeing her daughter made her feel, so she cooed and burbled because she knew precisely what was expected of her. But it didn't come easy. It hurt. Dances of you say this and I'll say that. But wasn't the dance dependent on everyone hearing the same tune? She hadn't gone deaf. If anything, she heard more acutely than she wanted to. She picked up tones and notes that had failed to register previously. She was hypersensitive to the unsaid, the evasive, the unanswered. But no different to her, everyone else wanted to be let away with their minimal offers, their parcels of sincerity. Men did it less. David had become unbearably earnest and well-intentioned and was drowning her in nice, which made her want to punch him in his face. He was trying to offset her negative space and fix the unfixable. If he asked her one more time if she was okay, she thought she would commit an act of extreme self-harm, simply to justify his compulsive inquiries of concern. He'd stand there just on the edge of her vision, not wanting to upset her, but incapable of leaving her alone, holding all his tension and yearning for usefulness in a maddening pose of airless indecision. And then, just when she felt like screaming at him to shit or get off the pot, the dreaded 3-word question would issue from his lips, as if his programming would simply not permit him not saying it. Are you okay? No, she thought, I am not okay. But let me take a lump hammer to my head. Let me drag my throat up and down the blade of a saw until its teeth are clogged with my blood and cartilage. Let me plunge my hands into a pot of boiling water. Let me step into traffic and be hit by a speeding car, so I am sent flying through the air in endless revolutions of blissful unconsciousness. Ask me then, she thought, when my skull is cracked open, when my hands are burnt raw, when my fingers run their tips along the Frankenstein scar of my neck, when I'm up to my chin in plaster. Ask me then, because at least then you will be able to see it. At least then you won't have to try and second guess my wellness. She examined her friend closely as she listened to her, looking for something she could recognize. She thought if she could see a reflection or a kind of hidden echo, some sort of reciprocal shudder, that maybe she could start to speak about the things that were real. She looked for it, even though she knew it wasn't there. She looked for it, even though she knew that no sane person would want to hear what she needed to say. She didn't need a good chat, or a heart-to-heart, or a shoulder to cry on. She needed a receptacle into which she could pour all her darkness. She needed her friend to have a valve in the side of her stomach that she could attach herself to via a tube, and through that tube she would pass the black emptiness that had parasitically colonized everything inside her that was vital and life-giving. It would leave her body like a shroud of fog, and she would watch it with staring eyes as its ominous murk seeped into her friend's organs and stole her light. Then the conversation would get real. Then an ignition of some kind would spark, and a new quality of knowing would register in her friend's eyes, and her friend would say, "Oh, so this is what's been going on." But her friend wouldn't cry in sympathy, because she would no longer have that capacity. They would simply sit there with a shared sadness and occupy the empty space together. Maybe they would never move. Or maybe they would slowly lean into each other and prop the other up until their mutual dependence meant leaving was impossible. Over time, they would calcify into an unlovely sculpture of exhaustion and collapse, soon after which concrete would be built around them, or on top of them, or in front of them, until they were subsumed as part of the general matter upon which new things would thrive and expand. Years later, upon being demolished, their organic matter would be the stuff of fascination, like finding horsehair in an old wall. A plaque would be put up. Here died a childless woman, more useful in death than life. There had been something inside her, and then there hadn't. She hadn't imagined it. It had really been there. She hadn't known she'd wanted it until it was there. And now it was gone. There was nothing she wanted more. But she refused the admission of that voice. It didn't help her, and it wasn't going to help her. She was merciless in that regard. She spat at herself for being so meek as to want anything. Too late for that. Her chance had come and gone. She'd missed it, and that's all there was to it. Time to toughen up. Her empty space made her ugly, she knew, but that made it easier for her to imagine her skin thickening, becoming coarse and grey like the hide of an elephant or a rhino, or perhaps a monstrous mud-caked crocodile. Nothing could penetrate her, not to wound her, nor to love her, not to sedate nor inseminate her. She had no ivory for hunters to covet, and no handbags, belts, or boots would be made from her skin. David attempted to flirt with her, and in various iterations assured her of her beauty and desirability, as if that had any bearing on anything. As if she was 12 years old and was being told she was pretty for the first time. She was a million miles from that. She was a million miles from love, She had finally come face to face with the lie of it all, and no amount of sweet nothings would draw the curtains closed again. You can have it all. You can be anything you want, and you will regenerate. Rubbish. She saw the con for what it was. She was Dorothy, and she knew the wizard was a scared old man who would never treat a woman as anything more than a child. There was no yellow brick road, there were no munchkins, and Kansas really was a storm-torn flatland, ravaged and disconsolate, with not a drop of joy or colour to be seen, just the black and white of relics and dead things. She had looked up the procedure online afterwards, as if by seeing it in its mechanical, medical coldness, she would be able to unhitch her grief. As if by viewing what was, for all intents and purposes, a hoovering of her insides, she could achieve a dispassionate state, an alienation. She needn't have tried so hard. What was an alien anyway, other than something whose unnaturalness repelled people? For weeks, she hadn't been able to get out of bed. A weight of darkness pressed down upon her. She took visitors, but she began to sense some of her friends recoiling from her. It was not done externally. They were too rehearsed for that. No, it was something inside them that held its nose, that backed away. Often it occurred as they acted out their sympathy. She could feel their tension, the conflict of their repulsion and fear butting against their learned compassion. And after a while it became obvious to her why that disgust was not palpable in her parents and their friends. They had nothing to infect or corrode, no precious pulse of life to protect. She herself began to pull away in return, even as she recognized the anger in her retraction. She found rejection everywhere, and it became so persuasive that she lost all sense of who she had been previously. She distrusted the past with its taunting parade of her earlier incarnations. It mocked her with the question, "Do you remember when you were whole?" She said goodbye to her friend outside the cafe, waving robotically as little Sadie leaned out of her buggy and stared back at her. As she walked in the direction of the car park, she was passed by a small group of schoolgirls who carried themselves like an entourage of bodyguards, an air of self-importance and raised status discernible in their wake. She couldn't help stopping to take in their procession along the path. Such was the effect of their force field. They were older, in uniforms, with heavy makeup and hair bunched high, 80s style. She saw their attention being taken by a mother and baby across the street. The baby looked brand new, nestled to its mother's chest in a carrier. They struggled to contain their squeals as they grabbed a girl in the centre of the group to make sure she hadn't missed the source of their excitement, separating slightly as they did so. Her breath stopped at the sight of the bump distending the girl's school jumper. The girl was suddenly the recipient of passionate hugs from her coterie of protectors, each of her hands being squeezed as they all moved on, a moment closer to motherhood. Her head was filled with useless, spiteful thoughts as she finally sat into her car. That girl's boyfriend probably only had to look at her and she was lit up with life. It was that easy. The ripeness of her. Even if she was little more than a child and probably terrified, it barely mattered because she would spring back from it just as intact as she was before, and she'd have help from her sisters and her mother, who was probably younger than she was. She'd bounce along with her little bouncy baby, not a single bloody bother on her. She'd jog home from the hospital and make dinner for her hot stud of a boyfriend and bang out a sibling for their firstborn in 12 months. And not because contraception was against their religion, but because they bloody well could. This flurry of condemnation flapped inconsequentially across the top of her brain. She knew it was no more than lashing at thin air. But a heavier, more deflating understanding was working on her internal gravity, pinning her where she sat. Her hands and arms hung lifelessly at her sides, as if she were a marionette whose tethers had been cut, and her mouth was slack as she gawped gormlessly into the middle distance somewhere beyond the windshield. She thought she must have resembled someone who had been heavily sedated, but inside she had become suddenly transfixed by an unarguable truth. She could have had it just as easy as that schoolgirl. She had been plump and fertile once too. Her Mother Earth had been ripe for the sowing of seed. Her body would have wrapped itself around that life and nourished it effortlessly, bringing it to fruition and delivering its wondrous vitality to the joyful world. And not a beat would it have taken out of her, because that's what a young girl's body was designed to do. But her dumb, stupid little girl's brain was so full of complacency and arrogance that she believed, like it was written in the stars, that she could choose her own time. She believed she could put it off indefinitely, that she could conquer the world first, that she could conquer it and then bequeath it to her children, and that world would be ruled by their love and joy. A horn blasted and she blinked as she was startled back to the here and now. A near miss, close to where she was parked. The two drivers involved had a brief, angry exchange and continued on, one by vacating, one by occupying. If only her own onward progress could have been so serene. Her car faced the canal on the far side of the car park. She wondered if she could generate sufficient speed to smash through the low fence on the perimeter of the car park and continue driving into the waterway. Too slow and too shallow, she concluded, before turning the ignition and taking herself home. By the time David pulled into the drive, she was on her fourth measure of attempting to burn through the numbness. She didn't like the way whiskey made her pick fights, so she kept to vodka, the cool heat of which she downed easily in a tall glass with soda and ice. The look in David's eyes turned sorrowful when he saw the glass on the bench. In return, she regarded him without affection and wondered when he was going to man up and kick her out or scream in her face or shake the misery out of her. The idea of him asserting himself was laughable. He was scared of her darkness and carried himself meekly, a gazelle tiptoeing around a carnivore. Why wouldn't he take charge of the situation? What was wrong with him? Did he not realize that his seemingly endless consideration was of no practical use to either of them? She could have given a shit about his precious concern. It was just him indulging himself, martyring himself on an altar of goodness. The good husband, the modern man. It made her want to spew. The sanctimony of it, the po-faced righteousness of it. She'd have rather he lost the plot. It would have consoled her much more to see him slide down the wall in tears instead of bearing up so well, instead of the never-ending display of control and temperance. Had she married a saint? Like, who was it for? It surely wasn't for her. So who then? Was he trying to bed one of the girls at the office? Fionnuala or Marion or that little triathlete from Longford? Or was he playing the long game, laying the groundwork now for future procreation? Nobody was a saint all the way through. Could she have been so unimaginative to have fallen in love with a saint? She rolled her eyes at herself. The vodka wasn't helping. Maybe she did want to fight after all. She looked at him as he washed his hands in the kitchen sink, the water flowing steadily from the mixed tap's dinosaur neck. He'd flipped his tie over his shoulder to protect it from the soap and water, and it irritated her now to see it. She used to like the fact that he kept himself clean, for a long time believing it was about her and his desire to please her and be attractive to her. But as she watched him rinse his hands and then go for a second squirt of soap to begin the process again, she suspected it was more about being attractive to himself. His personal hygiene, rituals and routines had always seemed a touch excessive, but knowing she could have been ceding time to far more sinister inclinations, she hadn't really let it bother her. That wasn't the case anymore. Now she had become convinced his relentless cleaning was about his addiction to control. He was in denial about the messiness of life, and especially about the messiness of what had happened to them. To her. It wasn't sand he buried his head in. It was soap and cleaning products. Scrubbing, scouring, rubbing, wiping, always followed by smelling and touching, as if his life was a huge scratch and sniff book. Everything had to be known and named and put in its proper place. A great classification of his world, nothing left to chance, nothing unplanned, nothing unrecorded. Her mouth hung half open as she stared at his sudsy, rotating hands. She suddenly reached out and flicked his tie off his shoulder and into the stream of water he was leaning over. He jumped back from the sink with a fright and began to frantically dab his front with a tea towel. The flash of anger in his eyes disappeared as quickly as it had come and was replaced by a bemused look that she found patronising. She heard herself apologise and say her hand had slipped. "Sure," he said, "no problem." He was still patting himself when her arm shot forward and pushed him in the chest. He was really startled now. She pushed him again. "What are you doing?" he said. She did it again, except this time she struck him in the forehead with the palm of her hand. His head snapped back. He was still reeling from that when her other arm swung round and slapped him on the side of the head, catching his ear. He exclaimed in pain at that one and staggered backwards, leaving an arm up to protect himself. She stood very still then, staring at him as if he were a curiosity or an upended insect dying in the sun. He was speaking to her. She knew this because she could see his lips moving, but she was very far inside herself and couldn't hear a thing he was saying. It was like she was falling backwards down a well, and his head was peering down after her, and yet the distance between them didn't change. She'd hurt him, not just physically, and his anguish was registered on his face, which was fleshy and distorted with emotion. Her eyes were drawn to the ear she had hit. The top of it burned bright red, as if a crimson glowworm had somehow smuggled itself in there to hibernate. She was overtaken by a yearning to soothe it with ice, and willed herself out of the well and back into her full-sized body so she could tend to it. "Your poor ear," she said as she went to the fridge. Her replenished vodka and a bottle of beer sat on the low table in front of them as they settled on the couch. He held an ice-filled cloth to his head, subdued and disoriented by what had just happened. She was less groggy than she had been before, but felt tired from her exertions and the effort it had taken not to withdraw into herself completely. Although there was space between them, she was still able to pull his hand away to monitor his ear's recovery. She couldn't stop looking at it. No blood had been spilt, but she felt she had inflicted a telling blow, and she was unable not to assign his pain a grim significance. A slapped ear was all it had taken to crack his shell. She hadn't stabbed him, or shot him, or kicked him in the groin. He'd gone down almost to his knees, over a little puck on the side of the head. If that was all it took, what chance in hell was there that he would understand for even a second what she had been through? His concept of pain, of trauma, was a universe away from hers. She had done him an injustice. She had given him far more credit than he deserved. It wasn't his fault. He had done and was continuing to do his best. It was just that his best was the equivalent of holding a match up to a hurricane. The intention was there, but it was never going to be enough. Thinking this way helped her feel less angry with him. And when she turned slowly to look at him, a shock of love made her heart ache unexpectedly. It was as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. He was suddenly in sharp focus and had a little aura of decency around him. The saint. And then it was gone, and all she could think of was how unfair it was that he remained unchanged, and it was up to her to drag herself into the future like a soldier home from war, forever scarred, forever altered, forever a stranger to peace. The phone trilled intrusively. She didn't want to, but she picked it up and answered it. As she did so, she watched him stand, the beer untouched, grab his car keys and leave. Her mother was saying her name on the other end of the line. She could tell by her mother's voice that this was not going to be a pep talk or the offer of a sympathetic ear. Not a chat, but a lecture. She steeled herself as her mother proceeded to frame and contextualize what she had been through. It had been decided by her mother that it was time to move on. She had encountered that cold toughness in her mother and her contemporaries before. Their compassion had a distinct shelf life, and beyond it they became impatient and bored, irritated by the apparent refusal to cope womanfully with what in their eyes had been ultimately an unexceptional experience. It was obvious to her that they spoke from the privilege of motherhood, and her ineligibility for membership of that group meant she had to forego certain rights, like being able to stand up to them and say that none of their experience mattered to her, and that she hadn't wanted to have a baby to gain their approval, that it had been something she had wanted for herself, and that when it was still happening, she had never felt more afraid, nor more alive, nor more full of hope and wonder. She was afraid to say those things because she hadn't gained entry, and she never would. And it hurt so she couldn't breathe. And she wasn't ready to let go of her pain, because that was all she had left of it. Her mother kept speaking, pushing her down more and more with every assertion, every matter-of-fact recommendation. She didn't need to be told to pick herself up. She didn't need to hear how things had been so much harder when her mother had had her. She didn't need to be told that, tough as it was, she wasn't the first woman to have lost a baby. She didn't need any of that. All she wanted was to be told she had done nothing wrong. She wanted to be told she hadn't failed. But to ask for that, to have to spell it out, would be too excruciating. The humiliation too total. And so she let her mother talk as she cried silently and drank deep from her glass and waited for the question that was waiting inevitably at the end of the call. David? Great, she said. David has been great. Okay, that was it. So you can come to your own conclusion. If you decide you think that's what I believe all women experience or feel like, or how all women process the experience of losing a pregnancy, losing a baby. I mean, that's not what I believe. I don't believe that. I believe that, I believe that's a very tough experience. My wife and I had a couple of miscarriages. And I have, female friends who had difficulties becoming pregnant or were unsuccessful in, trying to become mothers. So, some of those shared experiences, the experiences that were shared with me, the experience that I was a part of, they would have informed some of the stuff I put into my character's head. But I like that story personally. Anyway, that's grand. That's nice for me. Isn't it great? Isn't it great that I like something that I wrote? You have to think like that. Because there's no guarantee anybody else will like it. So look, I'm going to leave it there today, and I'll be back next week with something else. And yeah, so if you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, whether it's this episode or previous episodes, and there are plenty to go back and check out if you're interested, please do, share some love on social media, share a reaction. You can reach out, with things you'd like me to talk about or reflect upon. You can use the clearoutlive@gmail.com if you'd like to send me an email. Otherwise, you can leave responses on Facebook or on Instagram or on YouTube, where the podcast goes out on YouTube once a week, as well as all other podcast platforms. And the social media channels are just where I try and promote the podcast once a week. If you really like what you hear, you can show that love financially for the price of a drink, a sandwich, a couple of bars of chocolate for the chocolate fanciers, using the Patreon link, and that's patreon.com/theclearout. And all is welcome. Everything is welcome. Small contributions, really unbelievably large contributions are particularly welcome. And if it's not that kind of a contribution and you just want to share a nice response, review the show, rate the show, share it, pass it on to somebody else you think might get something out of it, please do, please do, because that's how this thing works. So that's it. So I hope you liked my story. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you choosing this podcast over the very many others that are out there. And I hope you enjoyed what you heard. And like I said, I will talk to you next week. All the best. Take care. Mind yourselves. Bye.